Good evening, everybody. Welcome, and thank you all for coming, especially on this evening. I'm Eileen Gillooly, and as the Executive Director of the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities here at Columbia, it's my privilege, as well as my pleasure, to welcome you to this evening's celebration of Lorraine Daston's new book, Rivals: How Scientists Learned to Cooperate. This is the first of what we hope will be many cooperative events hosted by the Columbia Global Reports, which my colleague Nicholas Lemann will tell you more about in a minute, and the Society of Fellow and Heyman Centers, otherwise known as the SOF Heyman's new book series in the Society of Fellows. It's a series which honors recent publications of the distinguished alumni of the Society of Fellows in the Humanities at Columbia, and which, founded in 1975, is about to celebrate its 50th anniversary. Before I introduce the speakers and turn over the proceedings to Nick, who will be moderating the conversation, I'd like to thank all the many folks who helped to make this event possible, especially Camille McDuffie, Courtney Knights, Allison Fink, Lindsay Schramm, Sylvia Jindick, Aaron Fay, and our co-sponsors, the Columbia Journalism School, the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought and its 1313 seminar series, and the Columbia Center for Science and Society. Lorraine Daston is Director Emerita of the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, a visiting professor in the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago, a permanent fellow at the Berlin Institute for Advanced Study, and an alumna of the Columbia Society of Fellows. Internationally acclaimed for her contributions to the history of science, she's the winner of numerous awards and prizes, and the author or editor of over 20 books, many of which she co-authored or co-edited with colleagues, thus showing herself to be a brilliant example of how historians of science have learned to cooperate. Will Deringer is an associate professor of science, technology, and society at MIT. His award-winning book, Calculated Values, Finance, Politics, and the Quantitative Age, which he completed during his residency at the Society of Fellows, is a history of how numerical calculations became an authoritative mode of public reasoning. His research interests range widely across time, from early compound interest tables and changing social relations in the English countryside in the 1600s, to the place of computer spreadsheets in the culture of Wall Street in the 1980s. Will is currently completing a book about the long history of present value as a computational problem, that is, the problem of determining what future property ought to be worth today. Alma Steingart is assistant professor in the Department of History here at Columbia, and had she not accepted a fellowship at Harvard days before we invited her to interview with the Society of Fellows at Columbia, she too would be an alum of the Society of Fellows. She's the author of Axiomatics, Mathematical Thought, and High Modernism, just out last year, which examines the influence of axiomatic reasoning on mid-century American intellectual thought, from the natural and social sciences to literary criticism and modern design. Her current book project, Accountable Democracy, Mathematical Reasoning and Representative Democracy in America, 1920 to Now, examines how mathematical thought and computing technologies have impacted electoral politics in the United States in the 20th century. And finally, Nicholas Lemann is the Joseph Pulitzer II and Edith Pulitzer Moore Professor of Journalism, the Director of Columbia Global Reports, and Dean Emeritus of Columbia Journalism School, a member of the New York Institute for the Humanities, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Academy of Political and Social Science. Nick is also a staff writer at The New Yorker and the author of 6 books, including, I think most recently, Transaction Man, The Rise of the Deal and the Decline of the American Dream. Please help me welcome the speakers.
give everybody a chance to just arrange ourselves. Welcome, everybody. I'm really glad you're here, and it's wonderful to see a packed house like this for this book. So I'll just say a few things, and then we'll plunge in. We have we're maybe like the journalism school itself. Columbia Global Report sort of sits in some zone between journalism and academe, and in that spirit, we have a more sort of free-flowing style of putting on events than people sitting at a table and reading statements serially. So I'm going to start by asking each of our panelists questions, and then I hope that a little ways into that they'll start interrupting each other and asking each other questions or responding. And then you know, at some point we'll go to being interactive with the audience, so please, I encourage you to do that. If you do, go to the mic. We have the good luck of being filmed by C-SPAN, and history won't record, and vast national television audience won't hear your question unless you say it into the mic, so when that time comes. Couple other things. I want to welcome Book Culture, which is here selling the book, our neighborhood independent bookstore. I want to welcome several members of Columbia's 1754 Society, an alumni group who often come to our events, and a warm welcome to them. And also want to thank the Lemann Foundation, which funded this book. I promised Lorraine I wouldn't use the term personal journey, even though we're using a more informal format. But I will say that the way I met Lorraine is, you know, in journalism, we're always debating objectivity. And it's kind of not the world's most scintillating debate. It has this kind of stale quality to it. And I was dean here, so I had to be in the debate, but I was getting a little weary of it. And I came across, somebody told me about Lorraine's journal articles that then, you know, turned into her book with Peter Gallison called Objectivity. And that just turned a light on for me. And I started teaching this material to our students. And I was very much struck by this and other work she's done, by how original and arresting and engaging it is. And you know, if we ever want to get back to objectivity, I'd be happy, but that's not our primary business. So when we started Columbia Global Reports, which is a nonprofit, nonfiction book publishing company, we bring out 6 books a year here at Columbia. You see what they look like. They're all in the same format, but they're on a wide range of topics. And we live on book sales and fundraising, hence the shout out to Lemann. When we started, just about the first thing I did was call Lorraine, and we had a couple conversations. I heard about this book. This was a fish that took a really long time to reel in, but now, almost 10 years later, since we first started talking about it, here it is, and we're thrilled to have it out. It's also, you know, it's history. Part of our journalistic impulse is to say, well, this is wonderful history, but what's the relevance to the present situation? So I might slip up and ask that, but I won't start with that, okay? So I'll just start with how did you get onto this question? You may know from the book that there's 2 long ago scientific collaborative projects that were international that Lorraine writes about. One is called the Carte du Ciel, and one is called the International Cloud Atlas. So what got you onto these?
Yes, well, first of all, thanks to you, to Eileen, and especially to Alma and to Will for being here, and all of you. You see, it really did begin in another project, as most books do, which was about the archives of the sciences. So these are the sources which some sciences gather in order to make possible the science of the future. And examples include especially astronomy and geology and evolutionary biology for obvious reasons. And I became very struck by something which ran counter to a great deal of my training in formal rationality theory, namely that these long-term collaborations actually survived. And the two examples in the book are examples of long-term scientific collaborations that survive against the odd. But the one that I began with, actually, which is not in the book in part because of the difference between German and English, was one in the humanities. The humanities really were in the vanguard of these large international collaborative scholarly projects in the mid-19th century. This was the great Roman legal historian Theodor Mommsen's Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum, which was a collection of all the inscriptions of the Roman Empire. And these are projects which start in the latter half of the 19th century. They survive 2 world wars. They survive decolonization. They survive revolutions. In the case of the Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum, it survives Germany being divided, Germany being reunited. And there are multiple opportunities, not only opportunities, temptations, invitations to defect from these projects. And some people do defect from these projects. They're an enormous investment in time, trouble, and money. But astonishingly, they persevere, they survive. So that was, in many ways, the seed crystal for this book, which was the puzzle, contrary to all the dictates of game theory, that people do not jump ship. Instead, they, at least a core of them, from generation to generation, we're talking about projects which last almost 100 years, sometimes more than 100 years, actually manage to endure as collaborations. All of these questions, of course, were sharpened by the events of the past years, that facing 2 global crises, planetary climate change and the pandemic.
2?
Only 2, yes. These are moments at which we would hope for some form of international governance to deal with problems which are global in scale. The only groups which managed to organize themselves on a global scale were the scientists reacting to both. So those were the 2 moments, I think, which germinated this book.
So now let's go through the specific examples briefly and tell us about them.
So the precondition for what I'm about to tell you is a technological precondition, which is in 1800, it took between 30 and 60 days to cross the Atlantic, depending on the season and the weather. But by the end of the century, around 1900, due to innovations in steamships and navigation, it takes only 5 days. What this makes possible are international congresses, not just international scientific congresses. The first international congress is in 1840 in London. It's for the abolition of slavery. But all kinds of face-to-face meetings of people who wish to organize on, if not a planetary scale, at least on an international scale. And the 2 examples which Nick mentioned are 2 examples in the scientific realm of these kinds of collaboration. The Carte du Ciel, which is the great sky map, was launched in Paris in 1887, gathering the crème de la crème of the world's astronomical community. And the idea was to have a collaboration amongst observatories scattered all over the globe to photograph the sky so that you would have a record of what the sky looked like from the Earth in the year circa 1900 to pass on to the astronomers of the future, to, as they said, the astronomers of the year 3000. So civilizations would rise, civilizations would fall, but there would always be astronomers, and they would be grateful for this astrophotographic record. This project, which was only supposed to take 5 years, dragged on until 1970 when the coup de grâce was administered by the International Astronomical Union. But it is still very much a part of astronomical research these days because it's only by looking at that record that we know about the appearance of new stars and the motions of the so-called proper motions of the so-called fixed stars. The other was a very different kind of operation. It was the meteorologists who thought that what we needed was a carefully calibrated guide, an atlas, to the major types of clouds, so that observers all over the world would mean the same thing when they said cumulus, cirrocumulus, nimbus, stratus, etc. This was also a product of a much smaller and more informal group who met in Uppsala, Sweden, in August of 1894 to create the first international cloud atlas. The Cloud Atlas is now, it must be its 4th edition in 2017 online, and is still being used by observers all over the world to standardize their perceptions and classifications of clouds.
Well, let me ask a couple other things. As I have vowed not to use the term personal journey, I'll also vow not to use the term key takeaways. But, we're not at the business school. But it's counterintuitive, as you said at the outset. We have the image of scientists as people with big egos who are always competing with each other. I got some of that from reading Harriet's work with her colleagues, but here they are working together. So why are they working together?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The balance that has to be struck is between intense, ferocious competition for the very scarce resource of recognition and honor, and some form of collaboration. And you might ask, well, why is the collaboration necessary at all? It's necessary because there are too many things to investigate. This is a realization that dawns on the scientists in the middle of the 17th century with the creation of the first academies. So they know they've got to somehow cooperate, but they consider each other to be arch rivals for fame and glory, and sometimes also now as then for academic positions. And the book is really about the very delicate equilibrium that has to be struck in order for the system to work at all. And the message is not that this was a problem that was solved once and for all, it's that it's a work in progress, and that at any moment it could be, and I think it is at the moment, being destabilized.
A few things about this. One, I guess we're working on this sort of in the high COVID period, and it was striking. I guess the way to put it is, what's the difference between collaborating on Zoom, which was not possible during the time described in your book, but is possible now, and having in-person meetings, which you describe with great spirit and humor in the book?
Well, for one thing, people can't get drunk on Zoom in the same way they can. And my impression from not the official protocols of these international collaborations, but the stuff I find in the archives, is that these were really quite boozy gatherings, and that was necessary because, to go back to the Carte du Ciel, the astronomical project, you just had to look at where the astronomers stayed in Paris. So the observatory in Paris, I don't know how many of you know Paris, but it's on the left bank. It's sort of on a hill at the end of the Boulevard Saint-Michel. Most of the delegates that came very sensibly stayed in that neighborhood, where they could walk to the meetings. Where did the British stay? They stayed at the Hôtel Anglais on the right bank, where they could hold their private councils of war against the French and the Germans. as to what telescope was going to be used, what grid measurement grid was going to be used. And the only way in which those very fierce altercations could be settled was over 9-course dinners at which everybody got extremely tipsy and became best buddies by the end of the meeting. It's really difficult to replicate that on Zoom.
While I'm asking the next question, I'm being advised that if you could move the mic a few inches away from
Sure,
yeah,
yeah.
okay. I assume a lot of people in the room have seen the movie Oppenheimer. The impression I get from the book is that could create a kind of false positive impression about scientific collaboration, in the sense that, for reasons that are obvious, one government is sponsoring the whole thing, and everybody leaves where they are and becomes a government employee in a very remote area, and that's the way to make a big breakthrough. But that idea runs counter to the way I read your book about when collaboration is successful.
Yeah, I mean, the Oppenheimer film has a problem which is even more fundamental, in which it is, the very name suggests, it's centered on one individual. And I mean, this is something that historians of science wrestle with all the time, which is the scientists themselves conceive of their history as a kind of Mount Rushmore of titanic figures. And it's not as if there aren't titanic figures, it's just that it is an intrinsically collective enterprise. And you get only the faintest glimpse of that in the film, even though Los Alamos was the ultimate collaborative project. And also, they're all there together with their families in a remote location, as you say. You've got to imagine the typical scientific collaboration as people going home to their home countries with their usual jobs, their usual preoccupations, and yet somehow they've got to sustain the momentum, the commitments they made after those 9-course dinners and the 4th toast to their colleagues in remote parts of the world. And it's that sustained quality of collaboration as opposed to the intense, secluded, very highly funded project of the Los Alamos kind, which is the template for scientific collaboration.
I want to push you to take it even one step further, if I'm not overreading the book, which is, if you want to guarantee the failure of a scientific collaboration, you would have it be done only by one government and controlled by the government, right? Am I taking it too far?
Yeah. No, I could imagine. I mean, the situation with Los Alamos was also anomalous in that it benefited hugely from the fact that there had been a forced migration of some of the most talented scientists in Europe, like Hans Bethe, for example, or John von Neumann, who were part and essential parts of this collaboration. So even though it looks like an extremely American project, it was in fact an international project.
But also, just to press a little more, if you're a government, if you're a head of state, you would say, I want to do this right, so I'm going to own the whole thing and control it and make it, a French project, not an international project. But that impulse would not actually be helpful to the work, right?
It depends on what it is. I mean, to take the case of the French, because of the French strength in mathematics, Alma would be better able to speak to this than I could imagine, frankly, an all-French mathematical project that could be quite successful. But the kind of project, an empirical project, especially an empirical project on a global scale, that's impossible to imagine with one government.
Well, let me switch, since you prompted this, to Alma and ask, if you study mathematicians, let's say we concede the point to Lorraine, can we cling to saying, well, at least mathematicians are solo geniuses and they work alone? Is that fair?
No. I mean, the simple...
It's called throwing you a
yeah,
softball.
Exactly. Yeah, the simple answer is, of course, that's not the case, right? I think that what's kind of interesting, because Lorraine starts the book with the cart, right? As this kind of last moment that there was still the belief that one individual, one scientist, or at least wanted to believe that can have do all the experiments on his own, right? And it's interesting that for science, I think the interesting question is that for science, we no longer has this belief anymore that there's the sole kind of scientist that can really do everything. She can do everything on her own. Yet for mathematics, we still have that. We still I think that for some reason, the real question should be, why has it been the case that the kind of self-formation of the lone mathematician has survived after? And I think, there's part of it is the self-fashioning of mathematicians that have done a lot of work over the years of making sure that that sort of vision of mathematics will continue. But all the stories that Lorraine tells in the book, there was the first International Congress of mathematicians, starts in the end of the 19th century. It still goes on until, of course, today. And more than that, over the past few years, we have seen very clearly that the rise of mathematical collaboration have really increased. I will say that one of the things that I really enjoyed about the book is this moment about the emphasis that is put on face-to-face communication. It's so important. It really reminded me. So the first paper I ever wrote, and I was still in grad school at the time. I was looking at this effort by mathematicians starting in the 1950s to write a proof. It took 30 years. There were about 100 mathematicians. The proof was thousands of pages, and the question for me was like, how can it be? How can they collaborate on such a thing? And the thing that came out is exactly this point about face-to-face. The face-to-face communication were incredibly important. But one of the things that the face-to-face communication were important for was not just this feeling of having a community that one belongs to, but also for the ability to understand what is the mathematical theory is. In other words, and I think there's been a lot of work by historians of science showing that the face-to-face in communication, it's not just, I love the idea of the 9-course meal. I think I want somebody at the NSF to read the book. So they will, the NSF will now start funding these sort of dinners. But I think that it's not just about that sort of kind of building of a community, it's also what historians have shown that even if it's about experimental knowledge or it's about theoretical knowledge, the face-to-face communication are fundamental for the ability of scientific knowledge to travel. In other words, the notion that one scientist can, or one mathematician, it's the same, can just simply publish the result, and then another mathematician or another scientist on the other side of the earth will just pick up the paper and read it and be able to follow up. It's simply not the case in most cases. In other words, the face-to-face is foundational, I think, for not just the kind of ability of the community to sustain itself as a community for long-term projects, but just for the scientific knowledge to actually circulate globally.
Well, are you buying this heavy emphasis on collaboration and face-to-face collaboration? Did that strike you as something you hadn't thought about before?
No, I actually, I agree. I really like it. I have a similar sort of, one of my dear friends is a historian of organic chemistry. And I remember reading many of his first paper he ever wrote was papers about this 1890s conference on chemical nomenclature. And again, the stories were always like, it came down to people getting drunk together. Like that was really the essence of it. But what really struck me about the book was that there's kind of two stories in some ways. And one is a story about scientific collaboration. And another is a different story, which is about what we might call kind of scientific community. And the thing that struck me was there's one story in the book, which is sort of what we have largely told, which is, or already been discussing, which is the history of scientific collaboration, of practical scientific collaborations that worked. Of specific examples of projects that span geographic space, that were international, that were enduring and influential. But in some ways, I didn't necessarily think that was what the book was going to be about. There's another story which runs kind of alongside it, not parallel, but interweaving with it, which is a story about the idea of the scientific community. And so in the book, there is, in addition to a succession of accounts of particular successful scientific collaborations is a fascinating kind of genealogy of the idea of what we would now call the scientific community. That idea that, you know, the scientific community came together in response to climate change, in response to COVID. And so in the book's 3 sections, there's a kind of wonderful account of the succession of these different kind of different sort of imagined concepts about what a scientific community might look like. In the 18th century, it was the Republic of Letters. In the sort of late 19th century, it was this kind of model of the World Congress, as we've been discussing, of kind of people, sort of leaders from all nations coming together in one particular place and having 9-course meals. In the 20th century, that gave way to a different kind of kind of trans-governmental, almost sort of United Nations style kind of bureaucratic model of the scientific community. And so the book sort of does 2 things. On one hand, it tells a story about about how successful collaboration happens. And on the other, it tells a sort of intellectual history of how it came to be that the idea that there was such a thing as the scientific community was even plausible. And I mean, now we kind of talk about that the sort of the scientific community rolls off the tongue is sort of remarkable. And one of the things the book does really usefully is to show that that's not at all obvious, right? It's not at all obvious that scientists constitute a community, that community can get along and do things in any way, that community could be international, that it can be enduring. So that's what really struck me. But the thing that I've been kind of turning over in my head is like, what do these 2 stories have to do with one another, right? There's a story about specific projects that worked, specific collaborations that worked. And then there is this other idea that there is such a thing called the scientific community that gets invoked to say, you know, the scientific community has a consensus on climate change, right? The scientific community has a particular stance on COVID policy. And I wonder if they kind of, how related they even sort of are. One of the really, last kind of thing that really struck me in the book is there's a couple of times you mentioned that the scientific community only really comes into being in the face of opposition, right? That in some sense it kind of the scientific community materializes in the face of threats, right? Anti-vaxxer movements, climate change skepticism, but even in earlier history, kind of national threats to scientific autonomy, like Lysenkoism. So I want to kind of put that question out there, right? Are these 2 sort of different histories, and kind of how do they relate to one another?
Yeah, please.
You know, so because I'm an intellectual historian, I mean, you guys know me, I believe in the causal efficacy of ideas. So I think before there can be the will to collaborate, there has to be a conception about what that collaboration, in what framework it takes place. And so I think that there's real work being done by these very different conceptions of a scientific collective, let's call it very neutrally. And these visions are really different. I mean, Will, you're right to say the Republic of Letters is Hobbesian in its conception. It is the war of all against all with sharpened pens dipped in venom. So it is not a cozy place. And even now, I have a very hard time. I mean, Harriet Zuckerman is in the audience. I mean, she would be infinitely better qualified than I to try to characterize the scientific community. But, this is such a bizarre form of a community. Nobody knows who belongs to it. Nobody knows who speaks for it. It consists of universities, journals, institutions, government institutions like the National Science Foundation, research institutes, which are, if very loosely, if at all, coordinated with one another. If there's anything that in some way supplies the glue for this community, it is the socialization and training that takes place in graduate school, and also, as Alma suggested, the worldwide traffic in postdocs, which is essential to the transmission of knowledge of all kinds. I think that it's, you have to have some, I think about the people at the Carte du Ciel who at any moment the British are about to go home. They're about to flounce off and just tell the French and the Germans and everybody else that, they can take their refracting telescopes and stuff it. And what keeps them there is partly national fervor. They don't want the British to be cut out of this. And also, though, a commitment to some idea of a scientific collective. And I think without that idea, I really do think they would have defected.
Can I jump in here?
Yeah,
really quick?
please.
Because this is one of the questions I was going to ask. So it's just about this. When I was reading the book, I kept thinking about the use of the word community, and I did something that I often do, which is I went back to William's keyword. I went with William's keyword, and one of the things that he says there about community is that unlike I hope I do it justice, but unlike other forms of kind of social organizations such as nation or society, it's the only one, community says, that is always used in the positive. That it doesn't, even in the connotation, that's the argument, that it's always used positively. And even right now, when you were it's kind of interesting because when you were answering the question, you used the word collective, right? And which kind of have a different, sense for what we mean when we say a scientific collective as opposed to a scientific community. So I wonder what it is about, specifically the use of a scientific community, which itself kind of brings in some kind of a imaginative. Again, if you buy the Williams idea of this, something that it's really is a positive. That there's
and it has a real sociological pedigree of that kind. I mean, Gemeinschaft versus Gesellschaft. The idea that this is more village-like, cozier, more neighborly. I mean, this, of course, will bring smiles to the face of people who have ever looked at the correspondence of scientists and mathematicians, and the terrible things they say to and about each other. But I think it's a really interesting point, Alma, which is there's a roseate glow cast over this by the word community, and when it starts to be used in the 19th century, it's used in a kind of, just as Will said, a kind of circle the wagons way, which is, why isn't the British government paying attention to the views of the scientific community? So it, just as Will says, it's adversarial in that way, but it is a sense that we are constituted as a community by the fact that others are ignoring us, with some other form of neglect or opposition. And I wonder whether or not, I mean, this is a story I don't know enough about to be able to narrate, but I think it would be extremely interesting to look at the fortunes of the word community, especially in late 19th and early 20th century sociology. And I think you can still hear echoes of that in Edward Shill's account of the scientific community, which is, you sort of hear Meinecke in the background, certain German theorists of the early 20th century, and his fierce opposition to Polanyi's free market. So Michael Polanyi is a Hungarian-American physical chemist, but also philosopher of science, and sociologist of science, who puts forth in the 1950s a view of the scientific community as basically the free market, which is so free market that even Hayek rejects it. And Edward Shill's, his colleague actually, a sociologist at the University of Chicago, says, no, this is like a religious community. It has certain traditions and values that unite it. And I think that's the moment at which exactly that positive content is crystallized.
So I want to sort of push back a little against where this has been going from a journalist perspective. So I wander into a university as a middle-aged man from a field that has no structure. It's structured as businesses, right? And we don't have any credentialing. So it was really striking to me academic disciplines which are not rich or powerful in the conventional sense. They don't have big headquarters buildings and billions of dollars in the bank. They sort of control universities because, if you don't have the disciplinary associations approved training and credential, you can't get a job. If you try to get a job in a physics department at Columbia and say, you know, no one in physics respects me, but I'm a really great guy, they'll say, well, that you're out of luck. So one way to ask the question would be, what's the relationship between these discipline structures and the idea of community, which is sort of softer edged? And the other would be to sort of disabuse me of my idea that this all works because it has these hardened systems and structures making it work.
So insofar as real governance takes place in especially now, the scientific world now, it takes place at the disciplinary level. So the book describes the last great attempt to have a kind of pan-disciplinary international scientific organization, which is wrecked upon the shoals of World War I. And now international science is organized at the disciplinary level. So that just simply confirms your point about the power of the disciplines. And the real question is, and it goes back to Will's point, I think, is at what point do the astrophysicists who belong to a particular discipline, particularly, suddenly start talking in grandiose terms about we, the members of the scientific community, embracing the meteorologists and the chemists, and God forbid the evolutionary biologists, et cetera, et cetera. And that, I think, is really a situation which is almost always socially staged. It's always a situation in which some other body which does not understand the disciplinary organization of scholarship and science sees it simply as, you know, the university, academics, science, tout court, and that's the moment at which this crystallizes as a banner under which all can march.
But I think I hear all of you saying, if somehow all these disciplinary structures didn't exist, there would still be scientific community. Am I hearing that correctly?
Well, not for me, but I defer to my colleagues.
No, I mean, I actually, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think that I think that the disciplinary structures are absolutely necessary, or is kind of the bedrock on which the idea of community exists. One of the big points I took from the book is that any of these kind of scientific collectives, going back to the Republic of Letters in the 18th century, and we could go back to the 17th century and the Royal Society of London, kind of famously, and even sort of earlier examples, that any scientific community needs a kind of well-constituted structure of exclusion, right? That it essentially needs to have some way of determining who gets in and who gets out, and the nature of those structures has changed. What made it possible to be a member of the Republic of Letters in the 18th century would have been different than certainly now what it makes it how one becomes a member of the scientific community as constituted in the 21st century. But I think that one of the really interesting dynamics in the book is precisely that the scientific community kind of depends in some sense on the idea that it is open to kind of everyone, and yet only open to the right kinds of people. And I think you leave the book in precisely on this interesting kind of tension around inclusivity and exclusivity, and the kind of in the future of this sort of scientific community.
Does either of you want to respond?
I mean, I would just say, I don't think, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think that if you stop if you stop the physicist today, we'll cross the street and we'll stop a physicist. And I assume that potentially they'll say that they belong, most of them might say they belong to a kind of international physicist community. Most likely it will be even more narrow. They'll be, I belong to kind of international astrophysics, international condensed matter physics, it's a community. I don't know that they'll say, I'm part of the international scientific community. And I'm asking, I wonder if they really do, if you'll stop a physicist and ask, do you really feel like you're part of an international scientific community? I would, if I had to guess, I don't think that's the case so much today. That
I agree. I think the only time they would say that if there were, for example, a politician, for example, who began to attack, as you can see what happened with the attacks on, for example, virologists during the pandemic, at which point the physicists did rally round.
And then the fallback will be on the scientific method, some kind of a version of. I mean, I'm trying to think about what would be the.
It's a good question to push because it's not clear to me. It would certainly be some sense of, if not the scientific method, of certain evidentiary canons of how things are done. But I think that also the disciplines, it's not just that the disciplines credential, they surely do credential, they socialize. And a lot of you have either been to graduate school in this room or are in graduate school in this room, and you know whereof I speak. It's astonishing to me the degree to which a very relatively short period in someone's life, let's say, 5 years, leaves an extremely deep imprint in terms of values, social networks, and a sense of who is one's peer. And I think that in itself is, next to, perhaps besides the military and medical school, this is an extraordinary achievement of group socialization, which was invented in the 19th century seminar and then imported to the laboratory in especially the German universities. And that, I think, is really as much part of the discipline as having the credentials.
Now, that's persuasive. So let me ask a question that must be asked at all panel discussions in any field these days, but I'll sort of back into it. At the end of your book on objectivity, what I prefer to see, but you probably wouldn't, as there's this teleological progress toward what you call trained judgment. And then at the very end of the book you say, again, forgive me if I'm misstating, well, maybe, but what if completely mechanical ways of measuring can get so sophisticated that they replace trained judgment? So where I'm going with this...
Going to ChatGPT?
Yeah, you know where I'm going with this. Or just generally sort of quantifying, mechanizing the scientific research to the extent that the scientists might begin to fade, if that's fair. And I detect a hint of that in the book Rivals, but tell me if I'm wrong, or I'd just like to know what you think about it.
I'd be really interested in what Will and Alma think about this as well, because I am no expert on ChatGPT. So let's take an example which is perhaps more mundane but better established, which is using machine learning programs to read mammograms, which is a kind of classical trained judgment kind of task, or electrocardiograms. And it seems to be that there's been some success in this. What's striking to me about it is that it seems to have been achieved in a very different way than, let us say, young doctors are taught, or young radiologists are taught to read mammograms, or even a young child is taught how to identify a zebra or a lion. The machine learning programs require tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of examples. And there's a group at MIT which specializes in tricking up machine learning programs, are thrown off by things which we would not even notice, a pixel out of place in terms of its, and this is not to say it cannot achieve a high level of accuracy, it's simply that it clearly does so by processes which are not the same as human processes. And the question is, given that we're extremely good at things like trained judgment, why do we want to spend a great deal of money and time and effort to train a machine which might be good at things we're not good at, to do things we're already good at? But this is a very
You're pushing
simplistic
against
question.
an open door, making that argument to me. But do you all want to address this?
Take ChatGPT.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be about ChatGPT, obviously, specifically, but
Kind of slightly adjacent, but I mean, one of the things the book takes on that I thought was really interesting is a kind of broader process of the sort of mechanization in some ways, of the kind of apparatus of the socialization of scientists in some way. So I think there's a wonderfully kind of tantalizing section at the end of the book about how basically increasingly the place that scientific community, it's not even the right word, but sort of scientific interaction happens in so many different sciences is through journals, but not only journals, citation counts, anonymous peer review portals, online archives, through a set of kind of increasingly mechanized and increasingly quantified tools that sort of determine what is good, what is not, who gets credit and who gets rewarded and who does not. And there's a kind of there is a kind of ominous story lurking in this book about basically in some ways how a form of scientific sociality that had been based on in-person interaction, on humans interacting with one another and forming relationships and learning certain norms, has been replaced by a kind of very utilitarian, very anonymous, very impersonal set of mechanisms. And I wanted to know sort of how ominous did you feel when writing that section of the book? Because it felt ominous to me.
I felt really ominous. I feel that, I think that's what I meant when I said that this is a system which is extremely precarious, jerry-rigged, at any moment can be destabilized. I think we're at a moment of real destabilization. And it starts, rather innocently because of the incredible volume as the number of scientific researchers worldwide expands. And many people will feel this way, that they are just deluged with requests to review articles, which they can't possibly do if they are to do the rest of their job. So you can see how this would come to pass. On the other hand, the Science Citation Index, which was the beginning of this trend, when it was first being bruited, Robert Merton wrote an absolutely prophetic article saying this is going to introduce all kinds of perverse incentives. And he was, unfortunately, proved right in every particular. So it wasn't as if it wasn't foreseeable, but the advantages, I think particularly for the government funding agencies, were irresistible. I hardly need say to anyone in an academic community that quantitative indicators, proxy indicators, are now far more powerfully weighed in any kind of evaluation process than the judgment of peers. So,
Alma?
But can I was going to ask a very similar question to Will about that. I mean, I also got stuck on that kind of end. But I was trying to be optimistic. I don't know why, but I was trying to be optimistic, and I was thinking, is there a way around the personal judgment? You can have all of those metrics, right? Those indicators, but would somebody get hired? Would somebody get a prize solely on that in the scientific community? In other words, because if we take seriously the literature in the history of science about the importance of face-to-face interaction and kind of people moving, the kind of close-knit, I was going to use the close-knit community that will it? It's not that. Of course, we know that indicators are becoming more and more important, but I don't know. I don't think that we are going to get to the point that they're going to completely take over the place of judgment.
Yeah. I wonder. I really wonder. I guess as long as letters are still being solicited for tenure and promotion cases, that perhaps is the case. But perhaps, this is entirely anecdotal, so really downweighted accordingly. But because in the German system, where I spend most of my time, Wissenschaft covers the waterfront. So if you have a big prize, you have social scientists, humanists, and scientists all in the same committee. You can see just how the scientists argue. They simply say, well, the X candidate has published so many articles with a Hirsch factor of Y, et cetera, and that is the end of their argument. So, and that strikes me as the way in which the wind is blowing.
In journalism, we encounter sort of the opposite problem, which is a sense, well, I teach a class every fall in this room, and this number of people, and I always start the class by saying, how many people here self-identify as an objective journalist? And no one ever raises their hand. This is before I've given them your book to read. And so there's this sense of, what's wrong, as long as we're saying there's a person in there and it's not just mechanical, what's wrong with being completely personal in how you respond to things? I don't think this would get that far in science, but it gets pretty far in journalism these days. And what I say to my students is, imagine you're a doctor, and you go to the doctor. The doctor's wearing a white coat, but doesn't look very warm, does it? So what the doctor's doing is signaling my doctor self and myself are two different people, or slightly different people. But I worry about losing that distinction. That's kind of the other side of the worry about, everything being quantified.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important point, which is there's an enormous difference between the exercise of judgment and subjectivity. So I take it that what you're describing, your worry, is of a form of subjectivity which is absolutely and openly personal.
Yes.
It is about my perspective from my background and my aspirations, etc. That is not what disciplinary judgment is about. Disciplinary judgment is on the basis, it's a reasoned weighing of many different factors, and because it's a multivariate weighing of these factors by someone of experience with a large class of comparisons, it's very difficult to mechanize, but it is not simply personal experience refracted through the prism of disciplinary jargon.
On that's eloquent. And on that note, let's go to participatory mode, if you're so inclined. Now, the only thing, Margot, is you have to go to the mic. Sorry. That's okay. Or somebody will bring you a mic, or Allie. No, you have to go to the mic. Okay.
Hi. This discussion, I haven't read the book, I'm sorry, I'm looking forward to doing it, and you may cover this, but this discussion reminds me of the moment, I think it was around 1980, when the US first pulled out of UNESCO. And I think the problem was, oddly enough, a journalistic judgment about the free press here and the free press there. But the people who made, at least in this country, the biggest outcry were the scientists. And they said, we're in the Cold War, for another 9 years. They didn't know that, but it was the Cold War. And this is the way we get to sit down with people on the other side and make important decisions that are both scientific and political. So I wonder, you mentioned, I think, the UN, and you mentioned the word bureaucracy with it, which is, it's quite acceptable. But I wonder if you'd care to comment at all on what influence UNESCO had when it was trying to get these people together.
I mean, I could say something about the UN more generally. I'm not sure I can say something about UNESCO in particular. So the UN in its early stages, so this is the early 1950s now, tries very much to get a number of key scientific organizations under its aegis. And they succeed with the World Meteorological Organization. They don't succeed with most others, although the UNESCO framework provides a venue for many scientists, especially during the Cold War, to meet with their behind the Iron Curtain counterparts. And it's a real trade-off, because on the one hand, it's very tempting. You have the prestige of the institution, you have funding. I don't know whether you have ever seen the World Meteorological Organization's headquarters in Geneva amongst all of the other United Nations buildings with these sort of gleaming glass, skyscraper, et cetera. No other scientific organization has such a building. But on the other hand, you get mixed up in the United Nations politics. So one of the first resolutions that's published is to exclude fascist Spain for as long as Franco is in power, which means that the Spanish meteorologists are excluded from this organization, so that suddenly you have a huge gaping hole in your data set for the Mediterranean. And that's a kind of Faustian pact which the sciences are constantly playing with both their individual governments, but also with these international organizations. And I could imagine it's the same with UNESCO, which is it provides a venue for scientists to be able to meet each other and communicate. I guess UNESCO's headquarters are in Paris, so in Paris, which they wouldn't have been able to do otherwise, but it comes with so many strings attached to it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Bernard, go.
So my question kind of follows up, I think, although it's less pointed, but and it has to do with the relationship between science and governments, politics, power. And I had a sense in the book that you maintain the two spheres, you try to maintain the two spheres somewhat separate, in the sense that you have this idea that you talk about the self-conception of the scientists as being autonomous and trying to avoid kind of government intervention, and you write about that a lot in a way in which the two kind of can be kept apart. And there are moments, though, when it's clear that they're deeply imbricated. For instance, when you mention the 1955, I think it was in Hamburg, the Science and Freedom conference meeting,
Hamburg,
right?
yeah,
in Hamburg, which was a real kind of free market kind of CIA supported in part project. And so the question becomes, if we think that actually the two are much more imbricated and can't be as easily separated, how then do we think about these questions about scientific community, et cetera? And in other words, if the knowledge is so deeply imbricated with the power, which has to be the case, given all of the funding that comes from governments for science, right? Then does that cast a different light or shadow on these notions of scientific community? Does it actually, maybe, as you were suggesting about what the purely positive aspect of community, does it become a little bit less clean in a way?
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, I would almost kind of push the question a degree further, or to sort of say a kind of a strong kind of counter hypothesis, right? Which is maybe that, could you say that the succession of models of international scientific collectives, that really what's driving them are sort of an underlying set of geopolitical changes or political changes, right? So it strikes me that in the 19th century, the model of the World Congress is at a time of great power politics, of a particular emergence of nation states in a certain configuration. In the 20th century, the kind of scientific community model, kind of modeled on the UN, is so driven by Cold War dynamics. And then into the sort of fourth phase, which isn't quite a phase in the book, but the one we've been talking about the kind of hyper-mechanized, sort of anonymous, quantified structures of science, as you say, are so driven by responses to government funding agencies, right? Essentially to starting in the 80s, the kind of new public management, Thatcherism, the sort of need for accountability. So there's almost a version of this that one might trace, where each of these successive stages sort of follows on kind of underlying changes in the structure of political power. I don't think that's right, but I think that could, I don't think that's the whole story, but I do think that could be a kind of possible provocative gloss on some
I mean,
of the
we're get ready and buckle your seatbelt because, you're seeing worldwide, and you may see in a year in the U.S. a tremendous hostility to all these structures of expertise and funding mechanisms and so on, and how that will play out. Maybe we'll be back to 18th century or 19th century science with no funding, but.
I mean, one of the things that's quite, if you look at the 1950s and 1960s, and, one of the things that's quite incredible if you look at the archives is that despite the fact that scientists are well aware that they're being funded by the government now, and they're basically dependent on governmental funding and military funding, they are insistent on their autonomy. It's very clear that there's this notion that, yes, we're getting the money. And you can say it's false consciousness, and a lot of historians of science have said that. I think it's like you can end there. There is something about their insistence on the notion that, yes, we're getting the funding, but the science is not somehow the science, right? This idea of that there is some kind of part of the scientific knowledge that's being produced that it's not impacted by where the money comes from, and that's been something that's been a hobby for historians of science, of trying to show to what degree does who pays the money actually makes a difference to what's the science that's being made. But I will say that for the scientists themselves, they're insistent on that, and they see. I'm thinking about some of the mathematicians that I was looking at during the Cold War. They were believing that the only way is because mathematics is not somehow apolitical. This is what it's going to bring. International collaboration is what's going to get us to world peace. That's what they're saying, and I think that there's something there to kind of contend it. I think there's some. I don't know that many mathematicians will still hold to this today, but I think there is still some resistance to this notion that the science that's being produced is all completely determined by the funding.
Yeah. It's undeniable that the political structures of power in each of the epochs that I treat in the book casts a long shadow on the kind of science that's being done or can be done. But it is always the case that, at least in the scientist's ideal view, it's a take the money and run situation, which is, they say, lovely, whether they're speaking to King George III of England, or they are speaking to the President of France, or they are speaking to Congress, their basic idea is, we know what we're doing, just give us the money and come back in 5 years, okay? And this may be, as Alma says, false consciousness, but that is, I think, their sincere position. And I think it's very important for their notion of a scientific community that there is this distinction between their pursuits and the larger structures in which those pursuits take place.
We have time for a couple more questions, so someone please.
Thank you. If anybody,
See you.
first of all, Professor Daston, if you would like to add things that I thought I couldn't find in the book Rivals, namely first scale, very much scientific contribution to collaboration, and to my mind, happens on a much lower level than what you discussed. You discussed the biggest, highest scale collaborations. If you would like to add something like what happens in research groups, and the collaboration is growing, I think. For example, the typical research article used to be 2 mentor-mentee. Now, if I look at the magazine Science, the average is probably at least 5 authors in every research article. The second thing that I was found, your motivations are basically in sort of external to science, to my understanding. My experience is, and it's just anecdotal evidence, that people scientists very much like to talk about science itself, and they're motivated, they learn from each other, and that stimulates collaborations, a positive one, rather than working against the rivals' motivation, which leads away. And the third thing that I would like you might want to comment is the what's happening now. We are at a school which, to my mind, is one of the leading universities in inter and transdisciplinarity. I'll just mention the recently established school, climate school. So what happens to the disciplinary organization in this new, I think, growing climate?
Yes, thank you for all three of those comments. Let me address the second one first. I absolutely concur with you. And I think that in the book, the model for all of these successful international cooperations is the ability, first of all, for especially the leaders of the field to get together and talk shop. And that, without that, there is no impetus to get these cooperations going. To the first of your points about the lower level corporations, it's very interesting. I was just having a conversation with Philip Kitcher about this a few hours ago. I think this has been going on for a very long time, but it's very hard for us as historians to detect it, although it is possible. We just have to try harder. The patterns of publication are such that the co-authorship, which is essential, the essential collaboration, does not take the form of co-authorship as it now does. So I'm thinking, for example, of the family as a model for a scientific cooperative unit. It was certainly the case for Darwin's family. Many astronomical families work on this basis because it's very hard to do astronomical observations by yourself. So there is also the laboratory model where I suspect, from the cases I know about the German case, for a very long period, they are very much cooperative ventures, but it is the professor's name which goes on the publication. So it somewhat masks the kind of phenomenon that you are describing. But I think that's a research topic, and I think it's a really interesting research topic. Thank you for drawing our attention to it. In terms of the third, I'm really curious as to what Will and Alma think. I don't think I have any insights about what's going to happen. I wish you well in the climate school, but I
want to add a word on the third question.
Yeah.
I've been involved for some years in efforts like that at Columbia. Sam Sia, my colleague who's over there, has been also. And I would just say, one, it's hard. It doesn't happen naturally. And two, if you think about, there's a vertical axis and a horizontal axis. So the horizontal axis, what I'm calling it, would be interdisciplinarity. And then the vertical axis would be implementation, taking the work of pure science out into the field. And that axis is, I think, even harder to motivate people to participate in than interdisciplinarity, although they're both hard.
Yeah. I mean, I'm trying. Maybe you guys can think of examples where, aside from something like Los Alamos, for example, where it's really worked well.
I mean, even if you think about, it's probably not the best example, but even such a big collaboration like LIGO, like the gravitational, sectional.
It's all. I mean, the astronomers are really singular in this respect. They're so much better at this than
but they have to have the engineers, right? They have to. There's so many different expertise that goes into such a big experiment that I'm trying to think about other examples beside LIGO.
Right, the Event Horizon Telescope, but it's more the astronomers.
Right.
Exactly, yeah.
So you had a question, and still have the question, or no? I want to do like one more question, and then we're getting to the end. So,
thank you. I am a physician. So in medicine, we have things called, let's say, the standard of care. So we follow the standard of care, but the standard of care is not written anywhere. Okay? We follow the literature. The literature is written by a scientific community. But when we say literature, what part of the literature are you talking about? So we have very influential medical activities that started with doctors in training. Let's say, like the H. pylori. Everyone talks about the H. pylori. It was a resident who came with that idea, okay? So credentials have like very little value, or not too much value. Academies are more social institutions. So there is no authority. So there is no authority besides those general entities. My question is, Professor, what did you have in mind when you wrote over and over in your book about governance, which is like the opposite of this kind of free market that we have in medicine?
Right. Yes. So I think first and foremost, the establishment of standard procedures. Let me give you some concrete examples. So the first thing that these international congresses do is to establish, for example, rules of chemical nomenclature. How do you name a newly synthesized compound? How do you name a newly discovered botanical or zoological species? What are the rules for giving credit for it? So that the primary form of governance in these international disciplinary organizations is to standardize procedures and protocols. They are notably, I must say, mute until very recently on exactly the kinds of things you might expect them to be more voluble about, namely scientific methods, scientific ethics, etc. These are considered to be not the business of the governance at the highest international disciplinary levels, but rather at the level, I think, of advanced graduate and postgraduate training. So it's a kind of pincer movement. At the very top level, the International Botanical Congress will decide about how fungi are going to be named or not, and that will be promulgated throughout the profession. At the much more microscopic level of the training of graduate students and postdocs is where, in fact, all of the things that we think about as governance, which is the internalization of standards of behavior, standards of proof, standards of argumentation, is taking place. Or at least that would be my answer. I don't know. No.
So I think it's time to wind up, but I'll just ask all of you, any final words from all? You look like you have some
I
thought.
have another question.
Okay.
I
Make this the
hope
last
it's okay. It's a
question.
question it's my personal question, but hopefully it will be interesting for the audience as well. Which is, you have described your work in the past. Your work as kind of the history of the self-evident, and right. I mean, I've in interviews. It comes through your work on probability, your work on objectivity, your work on observation. Most recently, your work about rules. And as you say in the introduction to this book, there is nothing self-evident about the scientific community. So is this a departure? I mean, is this book kind of a departure, or am I missing something if we think about this? Or is this actually a continuation of your work?
You know, I mean, the honest answer is I really don't know, Alma. But when I think about it, it's what Will said earlier about the way in which the word scientific community rolls trippingly off the tongue. So it has a kind of self-evidence in the way its usage, which the moment you put it under the magnifying glass dissolves. But that's something of a stretch, I admit. So.
Okay, well, this is a good time to wind up. I just want to thank everyone for coming. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, most of all, Lorraine, for writing this wonderful book. And it's really, a dream come true for us at Columbia Global Reports to be able to sort of be in this space between the academic and, ordinary people, and have things that are usually only discussed in these expert communities we've been talking about, discussable and discussed in the wider world. That's what we're here to do. So thanks a lot. Thanks to all of you. And that's it.